The jungle was immense, suffocating, and every step seemed to draw Sarah deeper into a labyrinth with no escape. She was alone. She had separated from the team hours earlier, but now all that remained was the absolute silence surrounding her. Every sound, the crack of dry branches, the buzzing of insects, made her heart race. Sarah was lost, and the scariest part was that she knew night was approaching. She clutched a torn piece of the map she had brought, but it made no sense. Every tree looked the same, every path faded into the dense vegetation. Anxiety began to swell inside her like a wave about to crash. No matter how hard she tried to stay calm, the feeling that she was being watched began to seep into her thoughts. Sarah glanced over her shoulder, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and the shadows of the trees stretched out, shrouding the forest in an early darkness. Sarah remembered how her team had decided to split up to cover more ground that morning. A decision that had seemed logical at the time but now felt like a fatal mistake. She began to murmur to herself as if her own voice could scare away the fear. "I'll get out of here. I just need to find a sign. Something. Anything." After hours of wandering aimlessly, Sarah stumbled upon a small stream. The sound of the running water was a momentary relief. She knelt down and filled her bottle with the crystal clear water, trying to ignore the knot of worry in her stomach. But as she caught her breath, a distant sound, almost imperceptible, caught her attention. A slow, dragging noise, as if something or someone was moving through the foliage. She froze. Her eyes scanned the trees, but there was nothing but leaves and shadows. As night fell completely, Sarah managed to improvise a small campfire. The warmth of the flames brought some comfort, but the noises of the forest were relentless, and now they seemed closer. Branches snapping, leaves being stepped on, small crackles coming from all sides. She felt like she was being surrounded. "Tomorrow I'll find the way out," she repeated to herself, hugging her knees and trying to push away the darker thoughts. But the dawn was cruel. Every attempt to close her eyes was interrupted by some noise. A louder rustling, a distant growl that didn't sound like any small animal. Fear began to morph into desperation. Sarah picked up a piece of wood from the fire, holding it like a weapon, even knowing it wouldn't be enough. "It can't be anything. It must just be my mind playing tricks," she murmured, but her voice trembled. Then it happened, the sound of branches breaking. Slow, calculated footsteps coming from the darkness beyond the reach of the firelight. Sarah stood up, the piece of burning wood trembling in her hands. And then, from among the shadows, two eyes appeared. Bright, fixed, predatory. Her heart nearly stopped, and the only thing she managed to say with a trembling voice was, "Whatever you are, please leave me alone." Sarah was paralyzed. The two bright eyes remained fixed on her, motionless but full of intent. The silence around her was stifling. Not even the insects dared to make a sound. She clutched the piece of burning wood with trembling hands, trying to appear larger and more threatening, but inside she was in a panic. One thing was clear: what was watching her was a predator, and it was too close. Then the animal moved. It was just one step out of the shadows, but it was enough to reveal its figure. It was a leopard. Its muscles were visible even in the dim light, and it seemed to glide over the jungle floor. The brightness of its eyes was now stronger, and its gaze left no doubt. She was the target. Sarah knew that running would do no good. Leopards were relentless and silent hunters. And in that situation, she was just prey. Time seemed to pass slowly as the leopard prowled, keeping a calculated distance, almost as if it were toying with her. Fear engulfed Sarah. Her legs began to give way, and she had to struggle to keep from falling. Her mind tried to recall everything she had ever read about encounters with predators, but at that moment, the information seemed to have completely vanished. What could she do? The fire was the only thing she had. The leopard paused for a moment and crouched low, preparing to pounce. Sarah knew the decisive moment was coming. Her eyes filled with tears as she lifted the piece of wood as high as she could, screaming in desperation to try to scare the animal away. The sound of her voice echoed through the forest, but the leopard did not move. It continued to stare at her, ready to strike. She felt the crushing weight of helplessness. Suddenly, a deep sound broke the tension. A deep growl echoed through the forest, coming from somewhere nearby. It was like thunder, full of power and authority. The leopard lifted its head, looking in the direction of the sound. Sarah also froze, not understanding what was happening. The growl came again, louder and closer. The leopard began to retreat, its eyes still fixed on Sarah, but now with a hint of hesitation. Sarah felt her heart racing even faster, but this time, it was a mix of fear and hope. Who or what had made that sound? Another predator? She looked in all directions, trying to understand when new noises emerged. The sound of leaves being crushed, branches breaking, heavy footsteps. An unmistakable sound. Something big was approaching. Sarah didn't know if it was her salvation or a new danger. The leopard, however, seemed to have made a decision. It took a few steps back, glanced over its shoulder, and silently disappeared into the darkness. Sarah was alone again, but not for long. The heavy footsteps continued to approach, and before she could process what was happening, she saw something emerge from the shadows. It was a group of gorillas. Gigantic, imposing, but not aggressive. The leader of the group, a massive silverback, was at the front. His eyes met Sarah's for a moment, and in that instant she felt a strange mix of fear and fascination. There was no doubt. The jungle had just decided to intervene in her struggle for survival. Sarah remained motionless, unable to look away from the silverback standing before her. He was colossal, with broad shoulders and a penetrating gaze that seemed to see right through her. As much as everything inside her screamed to flee, something in that moment held her back. It wasn't just fear, there was something in the gorilla's posture that didn't seem hostile. He was watching her, serious yet calm, as if assessing who or what she was. Behind him, other gorillas began to emerge. First, a female carrying a baby on her arm, then two young ones moving curiously but cautiously. The entire group was looking at her with curiosity. Sarah felt exposed, as if she had intruded upon a family's territory that was now debating what to do with her. The silverback let out a deep sound, a short grunt that echoed through the forest. It was a clear warning. He was in control. Yet something surprising happened. The gorilla took a few steps towards Sarah, but not in a threatening way. It was almost as if he wanted to make it clear that he was there to protect his group, and perhaps her too. Tears began to stream down Sarah's face. For the first time since she had been alone, the intense fear began to give way to a feeling of safety, albeit fragile. She didn't know if she could trust them, but in that moment she had no choice. The group began to move around her. The silverback remained at the front while the females and the young ones started to explore the area around her, as if ensuring there was no more danger. Sarah could barely breathe. She knew how dangerous gorillas could be, but she also realized that if they didn't want her there, they would have expelled her, or worse. One of the female's babies came close enough to almost touch Sarah's knee before its mother pulled it back with a warning look. Sarah began to relax a little, but the tension was still palpable. Slowly, she lowered the piece of wood she had been holding. There was no longer a need to appear aggressive. It was clear that the gorillas didn't see her as a direct threat. Still, she kept her movements slow and controlled, trying not to draw unwanted attention. The silverback let out another grunt and turned his back, signaling that he was ready to continue leading his group. What Sarah didn't expect was that they wouldn't leave. Instead, the gorillas seemed to accept her presence there. The family began to move, walking through the jungle with ease, but Sarah noticed that a pattern had formed. The silverback walked at the front with some females and the young ones around, and somehow she had been incorporated into the group. It was as if they were protecting her, even if it was merely out of curiosity. She decided to follow them, keeping a respectful distance, unsure of what would come next. The night passed slowly, but beside the group, Sarah felt safer than she could have ever imagined. Even without understanding the reasons, she knew that those gorillas had prevented something terrible from happening. The silverback, with his imposing presence, remained alert while the others seemed to relax. Sarah knew that this encounter was unusual for both her and the gorillas. It was almost as if the jungle had decided that, at least for now, she would not be alone. The sun rose shyly the next morning, and Sarah awakened to the sounds of the jungle. She was exhausted, but alive. The gorillas were nearby, and their presence curiously made her feel more secure. The silverback was standing, watching the forest closely while the others began their activities. Some females fed their babies, and the younger ones played among themselves, rolling on the ground and climbing low branches. Sarah, on her part, still didn't know what to do. They had accepted her there for a night, but how long would that last? And more importantly, what would she do if they decided she was no longer welcome? As the day progressed, Sarah noticed something curious. The gorillas didn't completely ignore her, but they also didn't seem hostile. They kept their distance but allowed her to accompany them. From time to time, one of the females would look at her with suspicion, as if evaluating each of her movements. The silverback, with his imposing posture, remained at the front, leading the group. It was evident that he had absolute control over the situation, and Sarah felt that her safety depended directly on his permission to stay there. Gradually, Sarah began to observe the dynamics of the group. There was a clear care among them. The mothers protected their young with a patience that was almost human, while the younger ones seemed full of energy, testing each other's limits in games that sometimes ended with warning grunts. Sarah couldn't help but smile as she realized how complex the bonds between them were. It was a family, with rules and hierarchies, but also moments of tenderness and playfulness. This made her think of her own family so far away now, and the thought brought a lump to her throat. At one point, while walking a few steps behind the group, one of the younger females carrying a baby in her arms approached Sarah a little closer. She was holding a piece of fruit and, to Sarah's surprise, deliberately dropped it near her before moving away again. Sarah hesitated but ended up picking up the fruit. She didn't know if it was a gesture of kindness or merely coincidence, but the moment made her feel a little less like a stranger. Perhaps in some way she was slowly being accepted. However, Sarah knew this wasn't permanent. The jungle was still a dangerous place, and the group of gorillas wasn't her final solution. She needed to find a way back to civilization, but at the same time, the idea of distancing herself from that group began to feel more difficult than she had imagined. They had become her only source of safety, and the connection she felt, even if fragile, was something she never expected to find. During the afternoon, Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion. Her body was weak, and her mind was still struggling to comprehend everything that was happening. She noticed that the gorillas were incredibly attentive to the surrounding environment. Every unusual noise, every suspicious movement was carefully assessed by the silverback, who always seemed ready to protect the group. At one moment, he suddenly stopped, staring intently in a direction within the forest. All the other gorillas froze, and Sarah did the same. The silence that followed was almost deafening until the leader decided it was safe to continue. By the end of the day, as the group paused to rest, Sarah sat in a corner nearby. She watched the silverback from a distance, thinking about how that gigantic, powerful animal had become her greatest protector. He was a force of nature, yet at the same time, he displayed a calmness that seemed almost inexplicable. Sarah didn't know what the future held, but at that moment, something inside her shifted. Perhaps it was hope, a feeling she hadn't experienced since she got lost in the jungle. For the first time, she began to believe that she could survive. The morning started off peacefully. The group of gorillas was more relaxed, and Sarah was beginning to feel like part of that strange but comforting routine. She silently followed the movements of the group, observing the silverback lead his family while the females cared for the young, and the juveniles played carefree. But deep down, Sarah knew that nothing in the jungle stayed peaceful for long. Tranquility was always temporary, and that morning, danger lurked closer than she imagined. While the gorillas rested in a clearing, Sarah heard a sound coming from the trees, a dry crack followed by an unsettling silence. Her entire body went on high alert, and her eyes instinctively sought out the silverback, who also seemed to have noticed something. He lifted his head and emitted a deep grunt. The other gorillas froze. Sarah held her breath. The sound returned, now closer. It was the same sound she had heard the night before, the sound of something large moving through the vegetation. Before she could fully grasp what was happening, Sarah saw a flash of gold darting between the trees. It was the leopard. He had returned. Sarah's heart raced. The predator was hungry, its movements calculated, and its eyes locked onto one of the group's infants. Sarah knew what that meant. For the leopard, attacking a baby would be easier than facing the silverback or any other adult. Panic surged up her throat as she looked at the gorillas, who didn't seem to have perceived the imminent threat yet. Suddenly, the leopard lunged. Everything happened in an instant. Sarah screamed, an instinctive reflex to alert the group. The sound of her voice sliced through the silence of the forest and made the gorillas react. The silverback let out a roar that echoed throughout the jungle, a sound so powerful that even Sarah trembled. He immediately placed himself between the leopard and the group, rising to his full height. The female closest to him grabbed her baby and retreated behind the trees, while the other gorillas quickly moved away, forming a circle around the most vulnerable. The silverback and the leopard stared each other down. It was a battle of wills. The leopard growled, baring its teeth, while the silverback pounded his chest with force, emitting sounds that seemed to challenge the predator. Sarah, paralyzed, watched from a distance. Her heart raced, and she felt tears rolling down her face. She didn't know if the silverback would be able to win that confrontation. He was strong, but the leopard was agile and deadly. The air around them felt heavy, as if the entire jungle was waiting for the outcome of that duel. The leopard lunged again, but the silverback was even quicker. With an impressive movement, he charged toward the predator, slamming his fists on the ground and roaring with a strength that seemed to make the surrounding trees tremble. The leopard hesitated, realizing it wouldn't be so easy. It retreated, but it didn't leave. Instead, it continued to prowl, searching for an opening, while the silverback maintained his position, vigilant. Sarah could hardly breathe. Each second felt like an eternity. After what felt like hours, the leopard finally gave up. It took one last look at the group, its eyes shining with frustration, and disappeared into the underbrush as quietly as it had arrived. The silverback remained in a defensive stance for a few more moments, ensuring that the threat had truly passed before returning to the group. Sarah exhaled, not even realizing she had been holding her breath. The silverback looked at her for an instant, and she felt that somehow he knew she had tried to help. But in that moment, relief quickly gave way to another feeling. The jungle did not forgive distractions, and she knew this wouldn't be the last time they faced danger. The group moved on after the confrontation with the leopard, but Sarah knew something had changed. The silverback now seemed even more vigilant, attentive to every sound, every movement in the forest. The other gorillas were quieter, almost as if they too understood the gravity of what they had just faced. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. If she hadn't shouted to alert the group, perhaps things would have turned out differently. But the danger in the jungle never completely disappears. It merely hides, waiting for the right moment to strike. A few hours later, the group stopped in a clearing to rest. Sarah sat near a tree, exhausted, while the gorillas resumed their activities. But something felt out of place. The silence of the jungle was oppressive, different from the usual sounds of birds and insects. Sarah noticed that the silverback had also picked up on it. He stood up, rising to his full height, his eyes fixed on something distant. Sarah tried to see what it was, but there was nothing but trees and shadows. The group was restless. Her instincts told her that something was wrong. Then the leopard appeared again, bolder than before. This time, it wasn't alone. Another leopard emerged from the vegetation beside it, and both began to circle the group. Sarah felt her blood run cold. She knew that even with all the strength and leadership of the silverback, facing two predators was an uneven fight. The gorillas began to emit nervous grunts, gathering the infants in the center. The silverback, however, did not hesitate. He charged forward to protect the group, placing himself between the leopards and his family. The first leopard attacked, and the silverback reacted with force, pushing it back with a powerful blow. But while he was distracted, the second leopard lunged from another angle. Sarah screamed, trying to alert him, but it was too late. The second leopard struck the silverback, leaving a deep wound on his arm. The sound of the leader's roar of pain echoed through the forest, and Sarah felt her heart constrict. He was hurt, yet still stood firm, facing the two predators with unwavering determination. Sarah knew she had to do something. Without thinking, she grabbed a piece of fallen wood and began banging it on the ground and shouting, trying to divert the attention of the leopards. The predators paused for an instant, confused by the unexpected sounds. The silverback took advantage of the distraction to charge again, placing himself between the group and the leopards. The confrontation was fierce, and after what felt like an eternity, the two leopards finally retreated. They vanished into the forest, leaving behind only the sound of crushed leaves and the smell of fear in the air. When it was all over, the silverback stood tall, but clearly weakened. He had deep cuts on his arm and chest, and blood stained his dark fur. The group gathered around him, emitting low, comforting sounds, almost as if they were trying to cheer him up. Sarah approached slowly, her hands trembling. She knew it was risky, but she felt compelled to help. Drawing from her knowledge of botany, she searched for plants that could serve as improvised bandages. Carefully, she cleaned the wound with water from her bottle and pressed leaves against the cuts, tying them with strips of fabric she tore from her shirt. The silverback allowed her to come close and tend to him, which surprised Sarah. That immense, powerful, and feared animal seemed to understand that she was trying to help. As she worked, Sarah felt a wave of emotions swell within her. Silent tears streamed down her face. She thought about how that incredible being had sacrificed himself to protect his family, and, in a way, her too. In that moment, Sarah realized she was no longer a stranger to the gorillas. She was part of the group, if only temporarily. And with that realization came a new determination. If she survived, she would do everything in her power to protect those who had given her a second chance at life. The days that followed the confrontation with the leopards were different. The gorilla group seemed to return to their routine, but Sarah knew something had changed. The silverback was still recovering from his wounds. He moved more slowly, but he continued to assert his role as leader, guiding the group with firmness. For Sarah, each day spent alongside them was a mix of relief and anxiety. She knew that at some point she would have to say goodbye. This was not her life. She needed to find a way back home. During a quiet morning, while the group rested in an open area of the forest, Sarah heard a distant sound. Human voices. For a moment, she froze. It was almost as if she were imagining things, but the sound became clearer. There was no doubt. Her team was nearby, probably still searching for her. Sarah's heart raced. She was saved. But at the same time, an overwhelming weight filled her chest. This meant it was time to leave. Sarah hesitated for long minutes. She looked at the gorillas, who were calmly spread around her. They were the reason she was alive, the reason she had endured fear and despair. The silverback, who was sitting nearby, lifted his eyes and met hers. His gaze seemed to carry something deep, as if he knew this moment would come. Sarah approached slowly and knelt before him. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for everything." The silverback made no sudden movements. He simply watched her for a few more seconds before turning to the group, as if acknowledging that the cycle had come full circle. The females and young gorillas were busy playing and feeding, but Sarah knew she would miss each of them. She had learned so much from that family, about care, protection, and even courage. They taught her how to survive, but also how to see the world differently. Summoning her courage, Sarah stood up and began to walk toward the sound of the voices. Her steps were slow, almost as if part of her didn't want to go. When she looked back, she saw the silverback still sitting, watching her. He didn't follow her, and the other gorillas remained where they were. It was as if there was a silent agreement among them. Sarah felt a final tear slide down her cheek as she waved gently, even knowing they wouldn't understand the gesture. And then she turned and continued walking. When she finally found her team, the reaction was one of pure relief and joy. They embraced her, emotional, unable to believe she had survived alone in the jungle for so long. Sarah tried to explain what had happened, but she realized it was impossible to put into words what those gorillas had done for her. It was something she would carry forever in her memory, an experience that transformed her in ways no one else could understand. Back in civilization, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would never forget the gorillas that saved her life. Using her voice as a biologist and researcher, she began dedicating her life to the preservation of the species and the fight against the destruction of natural habitats. In her lectures and campaigns, she shared the story of that extraordinary family that welcomed her in her most vulnerable moment. And every time she looked up at the sky, Sarah felt as if she could hear the deep grunts of the silverback, reminding her that true strength lies not just in muscles, but in the heart that protects those it loves. If this story moved you as much as it moved me to tell it, don't hesitate to comment below. I want to know, What did you think of the courage of the gorillas and the unexpected bond between Sarah and this incredible jungle family? Have you ever imagined going through such a transformative experience? Write to us in the comments. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss stories like this, full of emotion, learning, and reflections on life. Your support is essential for us to continue bringing such impactful stories. Until next time.